The plan was simple. I'd live in the house alone. Maybe, down the line, I'd rent out the spare rooms if I wanted company or needed extra cash. But for now, I enjoyed the silence. I had designed the place to fit my needs. One bedroom for me, one as an office, and one as a guest room. Everything was going smoothly, at least until my parents called. I hadn't even fully unpacked when my mother, Elaine, rang me up one evening. "Sweetheart," she started, her tone far too sweet to mean anything good. "Your father and I were thinking, maybe we could stay with you for a little while?" I paused, confused. My parents had lived in a small town their entire lives. They loved it there, or at least, that's what I thought. "Why?" I asked, already feeling something off about the request. "Oh, you know how it is," she sighed. "Your dad and I are getting older. The house back home is too much to maintain. And besides, you have all this space. Wouldn't it be nice to have family around?" I knew what she was doing, presenting it like a simple, harmless request. But my gut told me there was more to it. Still, against my better judgment, I agreed. I figured, why not? They were my parents, after all. If they wanted to be closer to the city and enjoy their retirement in comfort, I could accommodate them. I was making good money, and they weren't exactly well off. I even reassured myself that it wouldn't be a problem. I had my own space, my own office, and I wasn't giving up my privacy. At first, it wasn't so bad. They moved in and settled quickly into a routine. My mom took over the kitchen, insisting on cooking most nights, while my dad spent his time reading or watching old detective shows. I let them stay rent-free since I figured they had supported me growing up, and I owed them that much. For a while, things were peaceful, until my brother called. Daniel was my parents' golden child. At 29, he was their pride and joy despite being the least responsible person I knew. Unlike me, he had always been reckless with money, jumping from job to job and making impulsive decisions. I wasn't surprised when my mom casually mentioned one day, "Oh, Daniel and Sophie are struggling a bit right now. They might need a little help." I hummed in response, not thinking much of it. Daniel was always struggling. It was nothing new. Then came the bombshell. "They're coming to stay with us," my mom announced at dinner one night, as if it was already decided. I almost choked on my food. "Excuse me." "Oh, don't be dramatic," she waved me off. "It's only temporary. Just until they find their footing." I clenched my jaw, staring at her. And when exactly was I going to be consulted about this? My dad, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat. "It won't be forever, son. Just a few months, at most." I wanted to protest. I wanted to put my foot down right then and there. But I hesitated. Saying no outright felt cruel, even if every fiber of my being screamed that this was a terrible idea. So, like an idiot, I let it happen. Daniel and Sophie arrived a week later, looking far too comfortable for two people who were supposed to be temporarily crashing at my place. They had luggage, multiple suitcases, as if they were moving in for good. Sophie, heavily pregnant, sighed dramatically as she stepped into the house, acting like she was being forced into an impossible situation. "Wow," she said, glancing around. "This place is much bigger than I thought." Daniel gave me a firm clap on the back, grinning. "Appreciate you doing this, man. Really, it means a lot." I nodded stiffly, already regretting everything. I told myself I could handle it. They'd take the guest room, and we'd coexist until they got on their feet. But within days, it became clear that wasn't the plan. Sophie started making offhand comments about the house, how the guest room was too small, how it didn't have enough closet space, how the bed was too firm for a pregnant woman. And then, one evening, Daniel pulled me aside with that same confident grin. "So, we've been thinking," he started, rubbing the back of his neck. "It would make sense for us to take the master bedroom." I blinked, sure I had misheard him. "What?" Sophie, sitting on the couch, chimed in. "It's just, with the baby coming, we really need the extra space. Your room has the ensuite bathroom and the biggest closet. It's only fair." "Fair? Fair?" I looked between them, waiting for one of them to laugh, to tell me they were joking. But they weren't. They were dead serious. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "No." Daniel frowned. "Dude, come on. It's just a room." "It's my house," I snapped. "My house. My mortgage. My space." Sophie's expression soured, as if I had personally insulted her. "I just don't understand why you're being so selfish," she muttered. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't going to end well. I went to bed that night with my teeth clenched so hard I was sure I'd wake up with a headache. Every instinct in me told me I needed to put a stop to this now before it spiraled out of control. But I hesitated. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was just exhaustion. but I let the night pass without pressing the issue. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. I usually worked from home, but today I had to go into the office for a few meetings. When I walked out of my room, something felt off. The house was quieter than normal, which was strange considering my parents were usually up early making breakfast, and Daniel was always stomping around like he owned the place. I walked down the hall toward the kitchen when I noticed something odd. My office door was slightly open. I never left my office door open. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I pushed it open completely. Empty. The desk I had painstakingly set up with dual monitors, my expensive ergonomic chair, my bookshelves, gone. Everything was missing. No, not missing. Moved. Dread crawled up my spine as I stormed down the hallway toward the guest room. The door was wide open, and there, right in the middle of the room, sat my entire office setup. My monitors were precariously stacked on a small desk that wasn't even meant for computer work. My books were dumped haphazardly on the floor in a few open boxes. My chair, my goddamn chair, was shoved against the wall like it was an afterthought. What the hell is this? My voice echoed through the house. My mother appeared in the hallway, her expression tight but calm, like she'd been preparing for this conversation. "Oh, honey, you were out late, and we didn't want to bother you," she started, hands clasped in front of her. "But we had to make a few adjustments." "Adjustments?" I repeated, my voice dangerously low. Daniel and Sophie emerged from my bedroom, dressed in pajamas like they had just woken up from a deep, comfortable sleep. "You're up," Daniel said casually, stretching like he had the best rest of his life. "We figured we'd just get it over with since you were out all day. Mom said it'd be fine." I turned back to my mother, my pulse hammering in my ears. "You said it'd be fine?" She at least had the decency to look guilty. "Sweetheart, it just makes sense. The baby will need space, and you already had an office. It's not like you were using the master bedroom for anything special." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly. "While I was gone, you decided, without me, that Daniel and Sophie could take my bedroom, move all my things without asking, and shove my office into the smallest room in the house?" "Exactly," Sophie said with a satisfied smile. Something inside me snapped. I turned on my heel, marched into my bedroom. No, I refused to call it theirs, and grabbed the first thing I could find. A suitcase. "What are you doing?" Sophie's voice turned shrill as I started shoving her clothes back inside it. "Evicting you," I said coolly, tossing her shoes on top of the pile. Daniel stepped forward, scowling. "Dude, be reasonable. It's not that big of a deal." I wheeled around to face him. "Not that big of a deal? Are you kidding me? You stole my room in my own house. You are the guest here. I pay the mortgage. I pay for the food. I cover the bills. And somehow, you think you're entitled to the master bedroom because you knocked someone up." Sophie gasped in offense, but I didn't care. Daniel's expression darkened. "Mom said." "I don't give a damn what Mom said." I cut him off. "Mom doesn't own this house." "I do. And I never agreed to this." My mother finally spoke up, stepping between us. "Sweetheart, calm down. There's no need to make such a fuss over a room." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, but there is. Because this isn't just about a room, Mom. This is about respect. And none of you have any for me." Silence. Sophie clutched Daniel's arm like I was about to physically throw her out on the street. "This is unfair," she muttered. "We have a baby on the way. We need this space more than you." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You have two options," I said, voice cold and firm. "You move back into the guest room, or you move out. You have until tonight." Daniel's jaw tensed. "And if we don't?" I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Then I'll personally call the cops and have you trespass from my property." For the first time, real fear flickered in Daniel's eyes. Sophie's mouth fell open in shock. My mother gasped like I had just suggested burning the house down. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "Try me," I shot back. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one backing down. I expected them to fight back immediately, to hurl guilt trips and insults at me, to make me feel like I was the villain in this scenario. But instead, the house went quiet. Too quiet. Daniel and Sophie stared at me, their expressions twisted with shock and barely concealed anger. My mother just stood there, her lips pressed into a tight line like she wanted to say something, but didn't quite know how. And my father? He hadn't even come out of his room. Typical. For a moment, I thought, hoped, that they had finally realized they had pushed too far, that they would retreat, apologize, accept their place as guests instead of squatters trying to take over my home. But of course, I should have known better. I left them standing there in the hallway, turned on my heel, and went straight to my office, the guest room they had shoved me into without my consent. The rage in my chest was like a wildfire, and I needed a moment to cool down before I did something I'd regret. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, inhaling deeply, trying to force myself to stay calm. I had set a boundary. I had made my decision. Now I just had to wait and see if they actually respected it. For the rest of the day, I stayed in my office. I buried myself in work, my fingers flying over my keyboard as I tried to drown out the frustration simmering inside me. Every now and then, I'd hear hushed voices outside my door, my mother whispering to Daniel, Sophie letting out exasperated sighs, but I didn't go out to confront them. Not yet. Then, around dinner time, I stepped out. I wasn't avoiding them, but I also wasn't going to let them dictate when I could walk freely through my own house. When I entered the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks. There they were, Daniel, Sophie, and my parents, sitting at the table, eating dinner. Plates full of food, drinks poured, conversation flowing in hushed murmurs. But there was one thing missing. A plate for me. I looked at the kitchen counter, the stove, the fridge. Nothing. They had deliberately left me out. I let out a short, humorless laugh. So this was the game they wanted to play. Petty, childish, pathetic. I leaned against the doorway, crossing my arms. No dinner for me, huh? My mother didn't even look up. You weren't around, so we didn't know if you wanted any. I scoffed. Right? Because I've never eaten dinner in this house before. Daniel finally glanced up, his expression smug. You've been in your room all day? Thought maybe you were still sulking. Sophie giggled beside him, taking a slow sip of her drink. They were trying to freeze me out, trying to make me feel like I was the problem, like I was the one disrupting the peace. Fine. If they wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. I turned around, walked straight back to my office, and grabbed my laptop. It took me all of 15 minutes to type up an official eviction notice. I printed 2 copies. Then, without a word, I walked back into the dining room and slammed the papers down in front of Daniel and my parents. They all jumped, eyes wide as they stared at the documents. What is this? My mother asked, voice trembling. I pulled out my phone and set it on the table. It's an eviction notice. You have 3 days to leave. If you're not out by then, I'll call the police and have you removed. Sophie gasped, slamming her fork down. You're joking. Do I look like I'm joking? I shot back. Daniel pushed back from the table, his chair screeching against the floor. You can't be serious, he said, his voice low, dangerous. I'm dead serious, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. This is my house, and I am done being treated like a doormat. You're throwing us out? My mother finally snapped, her face pale with shock. I didn't even hesitate. Yes. Sophie let out a dramatic, choked sob. I'm pregnant, she wailed, looking at me like I had just sentenced her to death. You're throwing out a pregnant woman? Where's your compassion? I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. Where was your compassion when you stole my bedroom? When you treated me like an afterthought in my own home? When you pushed me to the point of having to do this? Silence. No one had an answer for that. My father, who had been silent this whole time, finally let out a long sigh. Son, let's not do anything rash. Maybe we can talk about this. I shook my head. There's nothing to talk about. You all made your choice when you decided to push me out of my own space. You have 3 days. That's it. I turned and walked away before they could argue. Let them sit with it. Let them finally understand what it felt like to be unwelcome in a place that was supposed to be their home. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of the real fight. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the events over and over, dissecting every interaction, every smug smirk on Daniel's face, every guilt-tripping sigh from my mother. But no matter how much I analyzed it, one thing remained clear: I had done the right thing. By the time morning rolled around, I was ready for whatever fight they planned to bring to my doorstep. But surprisingly, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I stepped out of my room cautiously, half expecting to find Daniel waiting outside, ready to argue. But instead, the house felt empty. I walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, where I finally saw my parents sitting at the dining table, whispering to each other. My mother was hunched over, her hands clasped together, while my father just sat there, staring at his coffee like it held the answers to the universe. Daniel and Sophie were nowhere to be seen. My mother noticed me first. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief. "Good morning," I said, my voice even. She didn't respond. Instead, she glanced at my father, silently willing him to say something. When he didn't, she sighed heavily and looked at me again. "They left," she said. I blinked. "What?" "Daniel and Sophie packed up their things early this morning," she clarified, her voice laced with bitterness. "They're staying at a hotel for now." I should have felt relieved. I should have felt victorious. But something about the way she said it, the way she looked at me like I had betrayed her, made my stomach twist. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "That was their choice," I said, keeping my tone neutral. My mother let out a humorless laugh. "Their choice? You kicked them out." "No," I corrected. I set a boundary. A very reasonable one. "They disrespected it. And they left." She shook her head, eyes filled with disappointment. "I don't understand how you can be so cold. They have a baby on the way, and you couldn't even, I've done everything for this family," I snapped, my patience finally wearing thin. "I bought this house. I pay every bill. I let them stay here rent-free. And what did they do? They tried to take more. They stole my room. They moved my stuff without my permission. They acted like they owned this place." My father exhaled through his nose, still staring at his untouched coffee. My mother, however, wasn't backing down. "They're family," she said. "That doesn't mean they get to walk all over me." Her lips pressed together in a tight line. I could tell she had 1,000 things she wanted to say, ways to make me feel guilty, ways to make me question myself. But for once, she didn't argue. Instead, she stood up from the table, grabbed her cup, and walked past me, heading straight for the sink. My father finally looked up. His face was unreadable, but his voice was calm when he spoke. "You're not wrong," he said simply. I blinked, taken aback. "What?" He took a slow sip of his coffee. I said, "You're not wrong." He exhaled deeply. "I didn't say anything when all of this started, because I thought it was just temporary. I thought Daniel and Sophie would get their act together. But they didn't. And I see that now." I stared at him, waiting for the inevitable, to follow. But it never came. Instead, he stood up, stretched his back, and turned toward me. "Your mother will need time to understand this," he admitted. "But you did what needed to be done." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd ever get from him. He gave me a small nod before walking out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. But I wasn't stupid. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because if I knew my mother, I knew she wasn't going to let this go. And I had a feeling Daniel and Sophie weren't done causing problems either. I had about 48 hours of peace before the next disaster struck. At first, things seemed almost normal. With Daniel and Sophie gone, the house finally felt like mine again. I could walk into the kitchen without feeling like an intruder in my own home. I didn't have to tiptoe around entitled houseguests or hear Sophie's passive-aggressive sighs about how hard pregnancy was while lounging on my couch, eating food she didn't pay for. For the first time in weeks, I could relax. But, of course, it didn't last. It started with my mother. She barely spoke to me after our last conversation. No more morning greetings, no more forcing small talk. Just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that meant she had accepted things. No, this was the storm before the real storm. Then, on the third day after Daniel and Sophie left, I got home from work to find my mother sitting in the living room, her phone clenched in her hand, a stiff expression on her face. The moment I walked in, she looked up. "They need to come back," she said, straight to the point. I stopped mid-step. "Excuse me. I went to see them," she continued. "They're struggling, and it's breaking my heart. They don't have enough money for a hotel, they're exhausted, and Sophie is." I groaned, already seeing where this was going. "Mom, no. She's pregnant," she finished, as if I hadn't heard that argument 100 times before. I tossed my keys onto the counter, exhaling sharply. They made their choice. They had a room here. They wanted more. They took more. I told them no. This isn't on me. She stood up abruptly, her face red with frustration. "They're family." I slammed my palm against the counter. "Then why didn't they treat me like family?" That stopped her. I watched as her mouth opened, then closed. No quick-witted response, no guilt-tripping comeback. Just silence. Good. Let her think about it. But then, she hit me with the real kicker. "If you don't let them back in," she said, her voice suddenly eerily calm, "your father and I will leave too." I actually laughed. A short, bitter sound. "Oh? And where will you go?" She lifted her chin. We'll go with them. We'll get a place together. I blinked. You can't even afford rent here. How are you going to afford rent somewhere else? She flinched, but she didn't back down. We'll figure it out. I scoffed. Right. Just like Daniel has been figuring it out his whole life. Her nostrils flared. At least he's not heartless. Oof. There it was. I folded my arms. You want to leave? Go ahead. I won't stop you. But if you think that blackmailing me is going to make me change my mind, you're wrong. My mother let out a sharp breath, like she physically couldn't believe I wasn't caving. So that's it, she whispered. You're just going to let your own parents walk out of your life? I met her gaze head on. No, Mom. You're choosing to walk out of mine. Her lips trembled, her fists clenched. But I saw it, the realization dawning in her eyes. I wasn't the one making the choice here. She was. And then, without another word, she turned and stormed out of the living room. I heard her footsteps heading toward her bedroom, the door slamming shut behind her. A deep, exhausted sigh left my lips. Was this really happening? I had expected pushback. I had expected anger. But I didn't think it would come to this, to my own mother threatening to leave just to manipulate me into letting Daniel and Sophie take back control of my house. And the worst part? I almost gave in. Almost. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't going to let guilt dictate my life. I wasn't going to let them win. And if my parents really decided to leave because I refused to be a pushover, then maybe they were never on my side to begin with. The house was quiet for the next few days, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that came from tension so thick it was suffocating. My mother barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was clipped, cold, distant. My father, as usual, remained neutral, though I could tell he was struggling with the conflict. Every now and then, he'd give me a look, one that said he didn't entirely agree with my mother, but wasn't about to argue with her either. I knew what was happening. She was waiting for me to break. She thought that if she held out long enough, ignored me, made me feel like an outsider in my own home, I'd crack under the pressure and invite Daniel and Sophie back in. She was wrong. One night, as I was working in my office, my father knocked on the door. I glanced up from my laptop, gesturing for him to come in. What's up? He hesitated before stepping inside, closing the door behind him. Your mother and I are leaving, he said. I blinked. I had expected this, but hearing it out loud still hit harder than I thought it would. I leaned back in my chair. And where exactly are you going? He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Daniel and Sophie found an apartment. It's small, but it's enough for them. Your mother wants us to move in with them, at least for now. I let out a slow breath. So that's it then? My father looked down, his shoulders sagging. I don't want to leave, he admitted. But your mother. I cut him off. This is her decision. He nodded. She thinks you're being too harsh. I scoffed. Harsh? For expecting basic respect? For refusing to let Daniel and Sophie bulldoze over me? He didn't answer right away. I get it, son. I do, he said finally. But she feels like you're turning your back on family. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. No. She's turning her back on me. My father winced, but he didn't argue. Maybe because he knew I was right. There was a long silence before he finally spoke again. We'll be out by the end of the week. I nodded slowly. Okay. I thought it would feel good, finally having my house to myself, finally setting the boundaries that I should have set from the start. But all I felt was tired. Tired of the manipulation. Tired of being the villain in my own home. Tired of constantly having to justify why I deserved to be respected. After my father left the room, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Was this really how it was going to end? Had I just lost my family? I wasn't sure. But one thing I did know? I had finally stood up for myself. And for the first time in a long time. That felt pretty damn good. The night before they left, my mother barely spoke a word to me. She moved around the house with quiet efficiency, packing up her things, making sure everything was set for their departure. My father, as expected, didn't argue. He just helped where he could, his face tight with unspoken words. And me? I let them. I didn't offer to help, didn't try to stop them, didn't try to mend something that had been broken long before this moment. Because I knew this wasn't my doing. They had made their choice. By morning, everything was packed. The house felt lighter already, like a weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. When my mother finally turned to me at the door, I half expected her to say something kind, something final, maybe even something that acknowledged, at least a little bit, that she understood why things had to be this way. Instead, she simply said, I hope you're happy. I met her gaze. steady and unshaken. I am. Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. Maybe because she could see the truth in my eyes. My father gave me a small nod before heading out the door. And just like that, they were gone. I stood in the doorway for a while after they left, staring at the now empty driveway. I should have felt some kind of grief, some overwhelming sense of loss. But all I felt was relief. I turned back into my house, closed the door behind me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let out a deep breath. No more walking on eggshells. No more entitled demands. No more feeling like a stranger in my own home. This was mine.